Welcome to the Inspirational Landlord with George and Tim. George, how you doing on this lovely day? You look like you got a nice tan. You been anywhere nice on holiday recently?
Just playing golf.
How's my complexion?
Yeah, it looks nearly almost as good as mine. You just want to get out on the golf course. But the great thing is when you got grey hair, it kind of pops you.
It does make you look slightly more tan, doesn't it?
Yeah,
If I need to dye my hair grey.
Honestly, it's like being an interior designer. It just pops.
We found an interesting article and we're going to analyse that article, and then, George, you're going to give us your feedback as a portfolio landlord.
Sure.
Sticking with the theme of the carrot and the stick. The article that I'm going to bring up now for the listeners or for the people watching is an article in the Times, and the headline is, "Do landlords have a future? The fate of buy-to-lets in 5 charts." So with increased tax burden, new renters' rights imminent, the article looks at whether these numbers still stack up. This article is broken down into 5 categories, and we're going to go through each sort of section, First part is, what are other landlords? So for landlords who are undecided, here are 5 questions to ask. As landlords ourselves, we want to know what the other landlords are doing in the marketplace, because that can give us a leading indicator into maybe what's going to happen in the future. Revenue and Customers Landlord Survey, published last week, found that 1 in 5 landlords plan to sell in the next 12 months. And 33% within 5 years, while only 4% plan to buy more properties in the next year and 8% in the next 5 years. It's broken down and most said the decision came down to tax, rule changes and property regulations. What's your kind of initial thoughts on that, George?
Well, I'm not surprised. I don't think any landlord out there is going to be surprised at that result. I mean, it's a shame that the government doesn't see it, or the people, in political circles don't see the damage that successive increases in what I would call a tax on landlords has had. You keep adding and adding, and eventually you will manage to break the system. So I appreciate back in the 2000s, there was lots of landlords, lots of buy-to-lets, lots of people making money. Then it all went into a crescendo in 2008 when you hit the credit crunch. Since then, there's been a dismantling of the profitability of the buy-to-let sector and the returns on investment that a landlord could expect. It started with wear and tear. It went into the removal of Section 24 tax relief on interest. It's culminating in the Rental Reform Act. And there's been 2 really bad effects of this incremental regulations and tax disincentives. And that is the tenants have had to pay more rent to cover the effects on landlords as they have to adjust their profitability, their business model. Because if you're not getting 10% on wear and tear, you're going to put your rent up by 10% now, or by 8%. If somebody said tomorrow all VAT is going from 20% to 50%, would we all be very naive if we thought that it would only affect the sellers and that it wouldn't affect the consumers? Of course it would affect the consumers. They'd all have to pay an extra 30% VAT and it would impact them. So it's naive not to see that every time you do this tinkering with the buy-to-let sector, you are damaging it. And every time they do, that it's always come home to roost. Landlords have left the market, thereby allowing rents to increase. And tenants are shafted, particularly good tenants. And it's not going to get any better with the Rent Reform Act, because the Rent Reform Act is a charter that says it doesn't matter what kind of tenant there is, it doesn't matter who you are, good, bad or indifferent, you're treated the same. A bit like bad drivers insurance. It's like somebody saying to the insurance market, you've got to give the same premium to a bad driver who's got bad driving habits as you do to a tenant who's got good to a driver who's careful, who hasn't got any convictions, who drives carefully and is risk averse. And this new thing of removing Section 21 is saying that the easy way for a landlord to move a bad tenant on or deal with a bad tenant is now going to become incredibly difficult. They're going to have to put up with bad tenants and find it harder and harder to get rid of bad tenants. And so that's going to eventually impact on the fact, like you say, go back to the point, tenants are going to start leaving the property market because of those things that affect them. You can't stop that, but it is a really bad effect for the tenants, and particularly if you're a good tenant who pays their rent and works really hard, pay your taxes, does everything right. You're going to have to shoulder the burden again for another regulation, And I think later in the article they talk about how rents have increased, and cannot just think that's down to greed of landlords. If anybody thinks, it's a sad thing that the narrative from the 2000s, where there were a lot of landlords and there were landlords maybe taking advantage of tenants are long gone. But the narrative still remains greedy landlords, and landlords getting really fed up with it.
On the actual article, there's a chart here from Source HMRC. It's important to point out that in the next 12 months, 73% of the market plan to just keep it the same. So not sell, not to buy anymore, but just keep the same. So, that's the majority of the people, landlords, that want to stay in the market need to be prepared, don't they?
Don't get me wrong. I think it's like any business. People will hold on. Very few people get out of a business before it goes pop. Most people try to keep the business going because they're passionate about providing a home for somebody to rent. They're very passionate about the kind of home they present, the way it's presented, how it's looked after, how it's maintained, the service that's given. It's not just about finance. But eventually, if you keep adding a burden to a system that's already under a lot of pressure, you will eventually break it. And that's how governments work. Let's just keep going, and then we break it. And then we'll go, we need to incentivize people to get back into building properties or buying properties to rent.
That leads us on to the next part about how much it costs to get started in buy-to-let now. According to Savills, a landlord typically needs about 86,000 in cash, up from 50,000 in 2014. In 2014, the average price of a rental was about 161,000. A 30% deposit of nearly 50k plus stamp duty at 1% meant total cash needed was around 50 grand. So that's now up to 84. So what's that? Like a 60-70% increase in the amount of cash required.
But just remember, that's not how much is needed to make it work. That's how much it costs to get through the door, to find out what's the other side of
That's the entry fee.
Yeah. Once you get on the other side of the curtain, then you've got to look and see what money you're making out of it. Because I would say off an 86,000 on that scenario, that's below break even. For what you're putting in is 86,000. I think you'll be lucky to get break even. If you think that break even would be, let's say 5%. So that would be, 4,500 as you to make profit with all your costs, insurance, repairs, and all the regulations, and the fact you can't have wear and tear, and the fact that you've got this, you just have to have one tenant moves in, and he just happens to be somebody that is a nightmare. Just as bad landlords exist, just as everything bad and good exists in this world. You get a bad tenant, right, who for whatever reason, when I say bad, he might just, for no reason of himself, he can't afford to pay the rent, loses his job, he can't afford the rent. But you're not able to say, look, can you 2 months, 3 months, move on? You're going to have to physically go to a court and get an eviction notice. Then you might have a tenant, lovely lady, just moved in. She's there 3 months and she moves out and says, actually, I don't like it here. So you go through the whole rigmarole of finally, you pay double rates while it's empty. You finally get another tenant in, and 2 months later, they turn around and go, I don't think this is for me either. So where's your return? It's gone.
Definitely. And that leads us on nicely. How much can you make? Despite perceptions of landlords swimming in cash, the reality is more modest. Most make less than 20,000 a year gross rent, a third make less than 10,000. Not surprising considering that half the market own one or two properties. 89% of those earning less than 10,000 own a single property, whilst 17% of those making a six-figure profit own 15 or more. There's a big gap. So it just shows you the narrative. It's going to be a tricky place for landlords of one or two properties. Just increased regulation, increased costs and hassle, and they're actually not making that much money. But it's interesting as well that 73% of people still want to hold or just not change.
We have a narrative that property is bricks and mortar,
A safe asset.
Safe asset. There might be various reasons why they're deciding to hold on to that asset. I don't know.
What would be your guess? Someone's got one or two properties, not making much money. It's not as profitable. Maybe they don't see it as a profit-making machine. Maybe they just see it as a store of wealth.
Do you know, I think that there's a part where you look at it and we've all got stories of how property has increased over the last, somebody bought a property for 50,000, it's now worth 150,000. We don't know what people paid for those properties at the start. They may be in a position where they didn't pay. So, the property has increased. So maybe their yield has been protected by the fact that the property has increased in value and they've accepted a lower real profit. So they've put in much less than required. But if they were to be totally commercial, they're probably making a loss.
I imagine, and I don't have the statistics about this up, but if you've got one or two properties, I've met a lot of these types of landlords, accidental landlords. They inherited a property, bought a flat, and then they met their partner and they bought a house and they decided to keep it. So they were so they probably and they switched it, bought it on a residential mortgage, probably 5%. So the upfront costs were a lot lower, for example, or their bank of mum and dad, all the different reasons. But I bet, that headline of 50,000 is obviously the average that they've taken. But I guarantee, a lot of those landlords of one or two properties are accidental landlords, and they probably paid a lot less to enter it or entered it accidentally.
This is the thing. I'm not trying to have a go at accidental landlords or landlords of one or two, but a certain amount of them, they'll have a different career. They'll be focused, there might be
on their career, on their children.
A nurse, and they've inherited this property. And their focus in life is not on the property itself. It's on what they're doing in their career. It's seen as a nest egg. They're happy not to look at it commercial. And maybe, and as regulations come in, I think they have to more and more compliance to those regulations. It may be that they're not making enough money. It may be just ongoing regulation compliance that eventually pushes them to a point where they go, not only am I not really making it, it's not commercially viable, it's a lifestyle choice. I'm now getting absolutely rammed with all these regulations. I've just had 2 really bad experiences of tenants. And when you get a bad experience of a tenant, I imagine it's the same the other way around, a tenant of a bad landlord. It leaves a terrible taste in your mouth, and you just think, is this all worth it? So yeah, I can see, and what it does illustrate is about the number of people who only have 1 or 2 properties. It illustrates just how many people are involved in the market of buy-to-let at the moment, and whether that profile is going to change with these regulations. The only landlords that will be out there are these large corporations that have multiple properties, and that's the only way they can make a profit.
Well, I mean, that is happening, and we've discussed that on previous episodes. It moves very, very slowly, as we know, and that's probably for another episode, including planning and all of that stuff and construction and market.
Sure.
But the last part of the article, it leads on to what's happening to the cost of rent. So rents, as most people listening, most landlords will know, that rents have skyrocketed, as the availability of properties has failed to keep up with demand, partly because landlords are selling up, not entirely. According to Rightmove property website, rental properties now get an average of 12 inquiries, up from 5 in early 2019. Excluding London, the average rent is $1,028 a month, up from $757 in 2020. So big increase there. According to news property website Zoopla, and average rents in London, went from 1.6 to 2.1 over the same period. If we focus on outside of London, 757 in 2020, up to now 1,028. And there's a chart on the screen now showing the average rent in the UK rising. It's a nice graph, which you'd love to see in business, which is up and to the right, which is not good for tenants.
No, but what it does illustrate is that the tenant has to ask, so people have to ask, has that rental increase been down to greedy landlords, right? Or is it down to the over-regulation and extra burdens placed by successive governments on landlords? And the answer to the question, because I'm sure you're going to answer it, but I'm going to answer it for you, is really obvious. If more landlords are thinking of getting out than getting in, why would that be if they are so greedy and make so much money? The reality is not true. When I started as landlord, just after in the 2000s, we would regularly have a conversation about dropping rents with the agents and say,
wow,
how we're doing. And you go, well, look, we put it on at £700 for a 2-bed. We haven't had any interest. So what about dropping it to 650? And you go, well, I need to rent it. So that's what the market holds. That's what the market holds. And that is a conversation that I have never had in the last 10 years.
Yeah, definitely. It's a conversation that's started to slowly creep in, but I think that's because now that we've hit that kind of like price elasticity.
So my argument is this, I'm sure they're all shouting a greedy landlord at me, but from that experience, what I'm saying to tenants is you are paying £300, £400, £500 more, right? As a direct result of the changes to the burdens that have been placed on landlords. In the old days, we couldn't find tenants without dropping our prices to today where tenants are having to be protected against bidding wars.
Absolutely. It goes on to, is anyone buying? So some landlords, however, using the opportunity to expand. And mainly this part talks about landlords with multiple properties, more than 10, saying it's a good time to buy, high yield, strong rental market, negative void periods, and now lower mortgage rates due to interest rates cut. What they're really saying in this part is that they're able to get better deals on finding buy-to-let properties. But they're also talking about the EPC. If they are looking to buy a property, they're very mindful about EPCs and making sure that this isn't something that they're going to get caught unstuck by. Any thoughts on that part, George?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to when we discussed this time, which was about being higher up the rung and having properties suitable to be in the best position for all the additional burdens that have been placed on them. New properties that are specifically bespoke for buy-to-let, for tenants, it's always going to put you higher up that ladder, which is going to make your profitability that bit better. But in reality, what's happening in the portfolio market, rental market, is that we've got a situation where the supermarkets, which is the larger landlords, the corporate landlords, are doing well, and the corner shops are thinking about whether or not it's worth their while anymore.
Last part of the article as well talks about the geography, so where to buy. And at the map, England shows the rental yields, Scotland, no surprise, northeast, highest rental yields, and down in the south, slightly lower at like 5.8, and up in Scotland 7.2, and northeast 7.8. So it's given us a good indication, but doesn't take into account, traditionally in more south you go, the more capital appreciation you get, in my opinion. I may be wrong. What do you think?
Here's the thing, and you're going to have to cover your ears.
Well, mate.
If you bought £100,000 worth of shares in Rio Tinto, which is a good, strong FTSE company, you would get 6.53% return.
Yeah.
And you'd have to do, and you know what? You wouldn't have to do anything. You can sit drinking your sangria.
Where you stay, greedy landlord.
You have no worries about anything. You wouldn't worry about references, inspections, and everything else goes wild. And if Rio Tinto does really well, the price will go up, just like in the property market. And as we all know, the property market only performs as well as the stock market. But 5.8% for a commercial venture is not a good return.
Mm-hmm.
So with all this increase in rent, they're still only making 5.8%. And that means their costs must have gone through the roof. And why have they gone through the roof? Because the burdens have been placed on them.
Where's the carrot? Where's the stick?
Is that the time?
What do you think, George? Where's the option? What's the carrot that can be used here? Because we know we believe in incentives.
Okay, look, we're in a cycle. Every business has one. They can't escape it. The cycle is the government will tamper with it, will tamper with the industry, tamper with it. They will increase regulations, and they'll reduce, they'll reduce, increase taxation, and everything else goes with it until such time as they turn around and go, wow, we've broken it. Nobody wants to do it. No one's interested. The smaller ones have gone off and done something else, where they've invested their money in the market, or they've done something else. They've decided they're going to do Airbnb or something slightly off the court, or, holiday homes or something different in the property market, or going to commercial property or something. But you tinker it, eventually you break it, and the market will slow. And that's the same with house prices. Something will cause house prices to come down. But in the rental market, more and more people will leave or feel that they need to leave. But it's a great opportunity at the same time, because if you can identify the next phase and take advantage of that, then you have got a period of upturn whereby you come out of the doldrums and you go up. If I can give you an analogy, a coffee shop, the old coffee shop used to go in, there'd be a pot of sugar on the top, a little cafeteria with tomato sauce. You get your toast or some soup, and you'd be in a Formica table and everything. It'd be a pretty rum place, right? And they all sort of they didn't last very long. Things went through a doldrum. And then suddenly you get shops that are selling coffee, and suddenly people want to sit, and they do it differently. They become innovative. They become imaginative. They create seats, and and people go and sit and actually meet and chat, because all the corner shops have gone. So the bakers, the butchers, the candlestick makers, they've all gone. So that's their point where they used to talk and catch up with gossip. Now they meet in the coffee shops. They drop the kids off at school and then meet for coffee. Somebody has a meeting, and like you and I, we need to have a meeting. Let's meet at the coffee shop.
It's cultural.
Yeah. And suddenly all of the small shop parades that were struggling, then you get coffee shops, and the Tesco, your supermarket, started opening up, and they started replacing the small shop with their own brand of selling. But it was slightly different in the sense that they brought in the prices from the supermarket. Doesn't mean that the people of the landlords are the same, but it does mean that there will be an opportunity, a place for landlords. Fundamentally, this is the reality of any country, but in this country, not everybody can buy a home. Not everybody can afford to buy a home, right? And it's very sad that it takes to their 30s and their 30s, even if they have a chance, that there is the aspiration of young people seems to be totally stymied by successive governments. The reality is that there is a huge demand for affordable properties. So there is going to be an opportunity when a government or an entity just sits down and says, what do we want? What do we need for these young people? We need 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom apartments that are of a high standard, that are built straight from the box. They cover all the regulations. They're not drafty. They're not damp. They're absolutely fit for purpose. They're renters, and they're like a staging point for someone in their life. They go in and they're built cheap and they don't suffer with all the regulations. They meet the EPC and everything's all pre-designed, pre-applied. Somebody comes along and says, right, start building as many of these as you can, so that the people who rent go straight from a university or from when they leave school, and they've got something that they can aspire to. They go, I've got a job. If I get enough money, I can buy one of these buy-to-let properties. But it needs, that's how it'll be. I mean, that's my vision. Somebody will come up with something that makes it affordable for young people to rent a property, and for landlords to benefit, to get a fair price, a fair return on the work that they do. And someone's going to just step back and go, you know what? They do a fair day's work for what they're trying to achieve.
George, what's the one thing you want someone to remember from today?
Yeah. Every cloud has a silver lining. Every disaster, every headwind is also a great opportunity in business. It's always been that way. When a market crashes, when all the stocks fall through the floor, there's always an opportunity where somebody comes in and does well out of it after the storm. Unfortunately, I wish I could change the government's thinking on what they're going to bring in, but they're going to bring it in. It's going to be disastrous. They're going to try and build more homes. I think they honestly want to, but they have no idea just how difficult it is in this market to build a new home. And they have to understand that in order for things to move forward, you have to have a carrot. You cannot just do everything over a stick, because all that sticks do is make people leave, and you need to bring people in. So one day there will be a carrot that will be out there, and you'll go, I can't believe they're now offering incentives for people to put their money into property to rent it to young people, because that's what has to happen. How else can young people rent if there's no one's interested in letting them in building a property for them?
I think that's a perfect place to end. George, thanks very much for your time today. For anyone listening who enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share it with some other aspirational landlords, hopefully, so we can spread the word. George, thanks very much for your time today.
No worries.
Appreciate it, and see you later.
See you later.